Everyone who walks the spiritual path eventually reaches a point where the mask of enlightenment becomes more attractive than the truth that came before it. It's subtle. You found something that works. Meditation, stillness, spaciousness within yourself. And without realizing it, you begin to hold on to it. Not because you have something to hide, but because it feels more comfortable than opening yourself up again to the chaos you came from. In that moment, a possibility arises. Not a mistake, not a sin, but a turn. The possibility to use calm as control, to turn silence into a shield, to appear aware while avoiding everything that could have truly touched you. That's where the Zen Devil is born, not as a caricature, but as something that stirs in each of us the moment we learn what awareness looks like, without still feeling where it actually comes from. It doesn't just happen to others, not just to spiritual teachers who lost their way, not just to people with power or followers. It lives in you, in me, in every human being who mixes the search for truth with the need for safety, control, or recognition. And the moment you think you're beyond that, it has already begun. The spiritual ego is usually not loud or obvious. It doesn't shout. It doesn't even always preach. It stays calm, humble, enlightened. But what it does do is create separation between you and the other, between awake and unaware, between pure and triggered. It knows the right words, the right posture, and most of all, the right distance. This is the first stage where awareness merges again with structure, not in the form of old identities we used to know, but in something far more dangerous because it's harder to recognize. It feels good. It feels open. But it's not free. The spiritual ego feeds on comparison, on the subtle feeling that you understand the path better than someone else, or that you've arrived somewhere the other is still moving toward. And even if you don't say it out loud, even if you convince yourself you've stayed humble, it will still be felt. In your gaze, in your words, in the way you no longer truly listen. Because the spiritual ego doesn't listen to understand. It listens to confirm it has moved beyond. That you remain calm while the other person is shaken. That you've let go while they're still holding on. That you stand above the situation while they're entangled in it. And all of that under the banner of inner peace. But peace born from distance isn't freedom. It's disconnection, disguised as serenity. What follows is a posture that seems almost untouchable. Someone speaks softly, moves slowly, reacts to nothing. Everything appears soaked in acceptance, compassion, and inner peace. But if you look closely, you can feel that something's missing. There's barely any movement, no real engagement, no vulnerability, just a form. The holy posture isn't an act. Often, it's deeply well-intentioned. Someone wants to stop judging, wants to be loving, wants to rise above conflict. But somewhere along the way, being human was let go of. Not out of liberation, but out of rejection. The inner unrest that once existed has now gone quiet. Not because it was felt through, but because it was suppressed under a layer of serenity. That calmness then becomes a weapon. Not a sharp one, but a slow, quiet defense mechanism. It creates distance. It dulls everything that's too much. And those who are too loud, too emotional, or too confrontational aren't rejected with words. They're simply ignored energetically. The holy posture doesn't push you out. It just lets you fade away. It's control, disguised as acceptance. Silence, disguised as strength. But beneath that posture still lives something unseen, unfelt, unheld. And as long as that core goes unacknowledged, there can be no real freedom, only containment. And that difference is noticeable. Not necessarily to the one experiencing it, but to the people around them. To those trying to connect, only to keep bumping into something hard, wrapped in softness. What makes it so deceptive is that this form of arrogance no longer recognizes itself as arrogance. There's no clear sense of being above others. On the contrary, it feels like you don't really have opinions anymore. You feel calm, detached, understanding. You believe you're open. But meanwhile, something in you keeps comparing silently. You might notice it during conversations with people who are still stuck in something. You stay calm, you don't react, but deep down there's a quiet awareness. I've seen this before. I've moved beyond this. And even if you don't say it, that thought shapes the way you're present. You don't feel equal, even if you believe you do. That's what makes this layer so hard to see through. There's no boasting, no open rejection, just refinement, just silence. But silence that places itself above the other is no longer silence. It's a boundary you don't dare name because you were taught that doing so makes you unenlightened. This kind of subtle arrogance doesn't come from strength, but from a need to no longer be touched, to stay above pain, to keep control, but now fused entirely with spirituality. And the longer you live in that space, the harder it becomes to stay truly connected to what is human. You feel less, not because you're free, but because you've slowly filtered yourself away. Behind all those layers of control and spiritual refinement usually lies something no one likes to touch: emptiness. Not the spacious emptiness people sometimes speak of in meditation, but the dry, lonely kind. The kind that forms when you've lived too long without real contact, without being seen in your depth, without being held in your chaos. Many people step onto a spiritual path not because they're so aware, but because they've reached a point where ordinary life no longer nourishes them. Relationships, work, surface-level interactions, nothing touches them anymore. Beneath that often lies exhaustion, not just physical but existential. A kind of tiredness from always having to adapt, to search, to explain. And then along comes a path that offers stillness, breathing space, a sense of quiet. But when that calm is sought out of avoidance instead of healing, it doesn't become a foundation. It becomes a blanket, not a homecoming, but a kind of numb presence. Loneliness then gets a new label. You call it time for yourself. You say, "I just don't feel drawn to people anymore." But deep down, you're simply tired of not being understood, and you settle for it. You call it awareness, but really it's a compromise. The fear that lives underneath is often old. A fear of being hurt again. Of once more feeling like you're the one who feels too much, asks too much, sees too deeply. So you withdraw. Not out of strength, but out of survival, wrapped in the language of awakening. That's how Zen Devils are born. Not from power, but from pain that never found a voice. Pain that became so familiar, you started mistaking it for peace. Not everyone steps onto the path from confusion or pain. Some people quickly figure out how it works, what awareness looks like, how to speak, how to look, which terms make an impression. They collect knowledge, not to become free, but to gain control over something others don't yet understand. Instead of seeking stillness, they seek influence. Instead of surrender, refinement. They don't build a foundation. They build a tower and climb it, looking down from above. That's the other face of the Zen Devil. Not a wounded child retreating into calm, but a sharp mind that knows exactly how the game is played and has no problem playing it. In fact, it becomes a strategy, an identity, a role. And the more intelligent someone is, the more subtly this form shows itself. Often invisible to outsiders, but still felt by those who truly look. Everything on the outside is in place. The words, the posture, the knowledge of symbolism, tradition, esotericism. But the heart is empty. Not empty from stillness, but from connection. This form isn't always found in yoga studios or retreat centers. You'll see it just as clearly in people drawn to power, structure, or the occult. Knowledge then becomes a weapon. The eye at the top of the pyramid sees everything, but chooses to give nothing back, only to take. And that is the difference. Knowing without being, seeing without serving, using insight without being moved. Where form is declared sacred, but the soul no longer lives within it. A Zen Devil is born, not one who got lost, but one who consciously chooses to stay above it all. And that might be the most dangerous form of all. Not because it's stronger, but because it knows what the truth looks like, and still walks away from it. You see it echoed in ancient symbolism. The eye at the top of the pyramid. The so-called all-seeing eye that oversees everything, not with compassion, but with control. An age-old image that seems to represent enlightenment, but in reality often stands for power without heart, for seeing everything, and choosing not to heal anything. In spiritual circles, that same principle is sometimes linked to the third eye, the center of inner knowing, intuition, vision into deeper layers. But if that eye is open while the heart remains closed, then insight never becomes wisdom, only overview. Consciousness becomes mechanical. Seeing becomes a function, something used to manage, to predict, to manipulate. And at that point, there's no more awakening, only observation from a distance. It sounds wise, it looks aware, but there's no current. It sees, but it is not there. And that's exactly what makes this state so misleading. Because for someone who has lived through years of inner storms, this feels like peace. It's quieter than before, more orderly, less painful. And so it seems like you've come home. Like this must be the destination. But stillness that comes from avoidance isn't peace. It's stagnation. A pause state that feels better than old suffering, but is still built on defense. And if you stay there, you'll slowly start to believe that this is what liberation means. Not being touched, not doubting, not feeling what once overwhelmed you, You're not deceiving yourself out of malice. You truly believe it because it feels better than what you knew. This layer is often an improvement, an upgrade in how you relate to your inner world. But it's not the end. It's a passage. As long as stillness is used to keep something out, it's not an open space. It's a closed defense mechanism. You keep the world at a distance, but also yourself. Not out of strength, but out of habit. And because it feels calm, it seems like it must be right. But true stillness doesn't arise from control. It doesn't come from managing feelings or avoiding stimulation. It only arises when there's nothing left that needs to be protected. When you're no longer busy holding, suppressing, or dodging. That kind of stillness can't be created, only recognized. Usually only after you've seen that everything you thought was stillness was actually a form of closing off. Not because you failed, but simply because you weren't ready to go deeper yet. And that's not weakness. That's human. But it's also not the end of the journey. Not really. Somewhere deep down you know that. Even if you try to convince yourself otherwise, this calm you found now, the clarity, the stillness, it feels like progress compared to where you came from. And it is, you've grown. You've taken steps. You've broken through layers that once were your survival. But instead of moving further, you get used to this place. It becomes comfortable. You know how to speak, how to react, what to show and what not to. And slowly, you begin to believe this is it. That this refined state of calm, control, and clarity is the destination. What makes it more confusing is that the system we live in actively rewards that state. The less you feel, the more effective you seem. Those who stay calm, who appear in control, who no longer get triggered, they rise. You're seen as successful, spiritually mature, clear. And if you manage to build something with it, status, money, influence, it starts to look like you've figured it all out. Like you've landed exactly where you're meant to be. But in the process, something gets lost. Not because you're weak, but because it no longer seems necessary. The urge to go deeper fades. The hunger for truth is replaced by the effort to maintain control. The drive to grow is traded for the need to hold your position. And the distractions are plenty. You're constantly engaged, with knowledge, systems, refining your energy, your behavior, your impact. But you no longer feel like you're moving. That's where the Zen Devil comes to life. Not as a mistake, but as a result. You get trapped in a reality that confirms you, rewards you, and keeps you in check. And as long as everything works, you believe there's no need to go further. But there's nothing deeper left in it either. No expansion, no liberation, no connection, only structure. And somewhere you feel that too. You sense something's off, even if faintly, as if something beneath the surface is asking for space, for motion, for something that can't be controlled or managed. Something that pulls you back, not to what you've become, but to who you were before you learned how to perform it. I'm not saying all of this because I'm above it. On the contrary, I still catch myself in many of the things I've described here. Sometimes I don't see it right away. Sometimes I'm already far down the road before I realize I've slipped into an old pattern. And then there's that one moment where I tap myself on the shoulder, as if something inside whispers, "Hey, look again." Is this really it? It's always a process. Awareness isn't a finish line. It's a repeated awakening. Not grand, not enlightened, just that subtle difference between reacting automatically and taking a moment to actually see. And the more often you feel that difference, the easier it becomes to find yourself again when you drift off. Without that awareness, it can feel like there's some kind of portal hanging above you, something that's clearly there, but out of reach. You feel its influence, but you have no grip, no context, no direction. You live beneath it, but it stays closed. And as long as you don't know what you're looking at, you can't do anything with it. But the moment you understand how it works, the moment you see what's acting on you, where it comes from, and how it shapes you, that portal changes. A staircase appears, not because the world suddenly shifted, but because now you know what you're seeing. The shape becomes clear. You don't control everything, but you have access, and that difference is enough. It's like subliminal messages. As long as you don't know they're there, they affect you. They steer your behavior, your choices, your reactions, without you ever realizing it. But the moment you learn how they work, you start seeing them everywhere. You notice the layers. You feel the influence, and you can respond. That to me is why I keep looking. Not because I know it all, but because I can now see I have something to come back to. I know when something is trying to steer me. I know when something isn't mine. And as long as I can recognize that, I won't lose myself. That's why this kind of knowledge matters. Not as theory, but as direction. Something you store in your awareness, in how you look, in how you feel, in what you no longer absorb automatically without checking it first. The clearer you recognize it, the less power it has over you. It's when you stop being driven and start being present. Not perfect, just awake. Because once you see the game, you no longer have to play it. And from that moment on, that's when it really begins.